I have watched countless young people walk through the doors of this courtroom with the unshakable belief that their bank accounts and flashy titles made them untouchable. But nothing could have prepared me for the morning Julian Vance made his appearance. 28 years old, the founder of a Silicon Valley tech startup freshly valued at $500 million, he didn't step into the courtroom like a summoned defendant. He glided in as if he were touring a dilapidated, outdated building he was considering buying just to bulldoze to the ground. Julian wore an expensive, plain gray t-shirt and limited edition sneakers, the unspoken uniform of the tech elite, designed to tell the world, I am too rich and too important to wear a suit or play by your rules. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't even entirely present. His eyes were glued to the screen of his smartphone, his thumbs swiping continuously, even as the bailiff loudly called his name. When the judge, a woman of steel who has spent over 30 years on the bench, someone who can see right through any lie and strip away any facade of arrogance, instructed him to put the device away, he let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. He looked up, met the judge's eyes, and delivered a line dripping with ice-cold disdain. Your Honor, my time is worth thousands of dollars a minute. Being forced to sit in this outdated room is completely irrelevant to me. What happened next in that courtroom proved a fundamental truth I have believed for my entire career. It doesn't matter if you own a tech empire. In this room, you are just another citizen who must bow to the law. And he was about to learn that lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. If you believe that no amount of money places anyone above the reach of justice, stay here and listen to every single word of this story. The file sitting on the judge's desk that morning was a civil dispute. Sitting at the plaintiff's table, not far from Julian, was Thomas Wright, a 62-year-old man who owned a small, independent carpentry workshop he had been running for 20 years. Thomas sat there with his rough, calloused hands clasped tightly in his lap. His worn collared shirt was ironed flat, but it couldn't hide the deep exhaustion etched into the eyes of a man who had spent countless sleepless nights staring at the ceiling. 3 months prior, Thomas's workshop had poured everything they had into custom building the interior for Julian's new corporate headquarters. The contract was for $85,000. To a tech billionaire like Julian, that was nothing but pocket change. But to Thomas, that money meant payroll for 12 employees whose families depended on him. It meant rent and the survival of his business. Julian had withheld the final payment, citing a vague dissatisfaction with the design vision, even though every detail was executed precisely to the blueprints. When Thomas went to the headquarters to ask for his payment, Julian had his security guards throw the old man out, tossing a toxic dare at his back. Go ahead and sue me. Let's see how long an old guy like you lasts against my legal team. When the bailiff called the case of Wright v. Vance, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was the heavy, pressurized silence that occurs when two worlds collide, one built on generational labor and the other on digital speculation. Julian Vance didn't stand up immediately. He finished a text message, tucked his phone into his pocket with a smirk, and finally rose with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who believed the audience was lucky to have him there. Beside him stood his lead counsel, a man in a $3,000 suit whose face bore the permanent, grayish tint of someone who had spent the last 5 years cleaning up the messes of a man who refused to believe in consequences. The judge didn't look at the lawyer. She looked at Julian. In her 30 years on the bench, she had developed a specific kind of X-ray vision, a way of reading the micro-expressions that reveal a person's true character before they ever open their mouth. She saw the way Julian's jaw remained relaxed, almost bored. She saw the way he leaned one elbow on the mahogany table, a posture that screamed disrespect for the institution. To Julian, this wasn't a house of justice. It was a minor bug in the operating system of his life, a glitch that his legal team was supposed to have patched weeks ago. Mr. Vance, the judge's voice cut through the air like a cold blade. You were asked to be here at 9 a.m. It is now 9:45. Your attorney tells me there was a scheduling conflict. In this courtroom, there is only one schedule that matters, and it belongs to this bench. Do you understand that? Julian didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a short, dry laugh, the kind of laugh used in boardrooms to signal that someone has said something hopelessly naive. Your Honor, he began, his voice smooth and devoid of any warmth. I have 3 international calls scheduled for this morning. My company is currently closing a Series C round that will define the future of logistical AI. With all due respect, the internal politics of a carpentry dispute are, well, irrelevant to the scale of what I do. I'm here as a courtesy. The word irrelevant hung in the air like a foul odor. In the gallery, Thomas Wright's head bowed slightly. You could see the physical impact of that word on him. His shoulders, already slumped from years of heavy lifting, seemed to drop another inch. To Julian, the dispute was a rounding error. To Thomas, it was the irrelevant $85,000 that was currently preventing him from paying the health insurance premiums for his crew. It was the money that stood between his workshop and a for-lease sign. Thomas didn't have a Series C round. He had a stack of past due notices and the names of 12 men who had worked for him since Julian Vance was in middle school. The judge leaned forward. She didn't raise her voice, which was far more terrifying than if she had screamed. "Mr. Vance, let's talk about relevance. You contracted Mr. Wright to build a custom mahogany boardroom table, 32 individual workstations, and a reception desk that was, according to your own social media, a masterpiece of modern craftsmanship. You took delivery of these items 3 months ago. You are currently sitting at those workstations. You are currently hosting meetings around that table, and yet the check remains unwritten. Tell me, in your world of high-level logistics, what do you call it when you take something that doesn't belong to you and refuse to pay for it?" Julian's lawyer tried to intervene, sensing the temperature rising, but Julian put up a hand to stop him. He looked the judge in the eye, his expression shifting from boredom to a sharp, toxic defiance. "I call it quality control," Julian said. The vision didn't align with the final brand identity of the firm. "In tech, we don't pay for legacy products that don't meet the future. If he wants his money, he can take his wood back. But my time? You can't give that back to me." The judge gestured for Julian's attorney to present their evidence for withholding the $85,000. The lawyer, sensing the judge's dwindling patience, opened a sleek, carbon fiber laptop and attempted to turn the courtroom into a boardroom. He began talking about venture brand synergy and material UX, claiming that the grain of the mahogany didn't project the forward-leaning, disruptive energy Julian's company required for its IPO launch. It was a classic Silicon Valley maneuver, using complex, high-sounding jargon to obscure a very simple act of theft. "Your Honor," the lawyer droned, "the aesthetic misalignment caused a significant delay in our corporate onboarding process. We had to hire a secondary atmosphere consultant to rectify the vibe of the executive floor. This $85,000 isn't a debt. It's a set-off for damages to our brand equity." The judge didn't look at the screen. She looked at Julian, who was currently checking his high-end watch, his leg bouncing with an irritated rhythm. Then she turned to Thomas Wright. "Mr. Wright, do you have photos of the work you installed?" Thomas stood up slowly. His movements were heavy, the result of 4 decades of lifting timber and breathing sawdust. He didn't have a carbon fiber laptop. He had a simple, blue, plastic binder. He walked to the bench and handed it over. Inside were printed 4x6 photos. They weren't filtered or edited for social media. They were raw, honest images of craftsmanship. The deep, wine-colored mahogany of the table glowed with 20 coats of hand-rubbed oil. The joints of the workstations were so precise, they looked like they had grown together naturally. "I spent 600 hours on that table, Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice cracking slightly before he steadied it. "I picked the slabs myself from a sustainable yard in Pennsylvania. I didn't build brand equity. I built furniture that will last 100 years. Mr. Vance sat at that table the day we finished. He shook my hand. He told me it was the best thing in the building." The judge flipped through the photos, then looked back at Julian. The millionaire was staring at the ceiling, a smirk of toxic defiance still playing on his lips. He looked like a man who thought he was playing a game that the judge didn't understand. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, her voice dropping to a dangerous register, "your lawyer says this furniture was a legacy product that didn't meet your future vision. But my staff does a little research before I take the bench. I have here a printout from your personal Instagram account, dated exactly 2 weeks ago." She pulled a piece of paper from her folder. It was a photo of Julian, leaning back in his executive chair, his feet shod in those $1,000 sneakers propped up on Thomas Wright's mahogany desk. The caption read, "The new HQ is finally reflecting the elite standard of the Vance Empire. Every detail screams perfection. We don't settle for anything but the best." The courtroom went dead silent. Julian's smirk didn't disappear, but it froze. The Series C founder suddenly found himself trapped by his own vanity. "Now, Julian," the judge continued, using his first name like a mother about to discipline a child, "help me bridge the gap in my logistics. How is this desk perfection on your social media when you're trying to impress investors, but irrelevant trash in this courtroom when it's time to pay the man who built it? You aren't disrupting the furniture industry, Mr. Vance. You're just a common deadbeat in a very expensive t-shirt. Julian's jaw tightened. For the first time, the man of the future looked like he was realizing that the rules of the past were about to crash his system. The silence in the room was no longer the silence of respect. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. Julian Vance, the man who claimed his time was worth thousands per minute, was suddenly frozen. The toxic defiance that had served as his shield was beginning to crack. I watched his face, the way his eyes darted to his attorney, the way the slight, arrogant tilt of his head straightened into a rigid, defensive posture. For a man who built his life on data integrity, he had just been exposed as a fraud by his own digital footprint. Julian's attorney cleared his throat, a desperate, scratching sound. Your Honor, social media it's a marketing tool. It's aspirational. The post was intended for investor relations, not as a technical endorsement of the furniture's quality. Aspirational? The judge's voice was a low growl. She turned her gaze to Thomas Wright. Mr. Wright, when you were sanding that mahogany until your fingers were raw, were you doing it aspirationally? When you were paying your lumber supplier out of your personal savings because this tech titan here decided to play games with your life, was that a marketing tool? Thomas didn't look at Julian. He looked at his own hands, the scarred, calloused hands of a builder. I just wanted to do a good job, Your Honor, he said softly. I've never had a client not pay, not in 20 years. I have 12 men who have been with me since the beginning. I had to tell them last week I might have to let them go. These are men with mortgages, men with kids in college. To Mr. Vance, $85,000 is a set-off for his vibe. To us, it's the difference between staying open and losing everything. The judge turned back to Julian. This was the moment the volcano began to erupt. You see, Julian, that's the problem with your future vision. You're so busy looking at the horizon that you've forgotten how to look at the human being standing right in front of you. You called this man's life's work irrelevant. You called this courtroom irrelevant. But let me tell you what is truly irrelevant in this room. Your Series C funding, your IPO, your brand equity. None of that exists here. She slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. What exists here is a contract. What exists here is a man who did the work, and a boy who thinks he's too important to pay for it. You think you're disrupting things? You're not disrupting anything. You're just a bully with a faster internet connection than the rest of us. Julian finally spoke, his voice losing its polished boardroom edge. It was thinner now, more desperate. Look, if it's about the money, I can have my assistant wire the $85,000 right now. Can we just move on? I have a board meeting at noon. The judge's eyes narrowed. You think you can just click a button and make your character deficit disappear? You think this is a transaction? No, Julian. We are far past a simple wire transfer. You sat in my courtroom and insulted the dignity of labor. You insulted this bench? And you think a board meeting at noon is your biggest concern today? You are about to find out exactly how relevant the law can be when it decides to pull the plug on your arrogance. I can have my assistant wire the money right now. Those 10 words from Julian Vance were perhaps the most expensive mistake he had made all year. In his world, a world of venture capital, liquidated damages, and moving fast and breaking things money, was the universal solvent. It dissolved problems. It silenced critics. It bought time. But as those words echoed against the high ceilings of the courtroom, Julian realized too late that he was no longer in his world. He was in hers. The judge leaned back, a terrifyingly calm smile spreading across her face. It wasn't a smile of warmth. It was the smile of a predator watching a prey animal walk directly into a trap. You think this is a drive-through, Julian? You think you can treat my courtroom like a late payment office where you only settle the bill when you're caught? She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his with the weight of a physical blow. Put your checkbook away. We aren't doing a wire transfer today, because in this room, your money has no power until I give it permission to have some. I watched Julian's hands. For the first time, they weren't scrolling or tapping. They were gripped white-knuckled on the edge of the mahogany table, the very wood he had called irrelevant. A bead of sweat began to track down his temple, ruining the carefully curated image of the unbothered genius. His lawyer was frantically whispering in his ear, but Julian pushed him away. The toxic defiance was still there, flickering like a dying candle, but it was being replaced by something Julian hadn't felt in a long time: genuine, unscripted fear. "Mr. Wright," the judge said, her voice softening as she addressed the carpenter, "this man owes you $85,000 for the work, but he also owes you for the 3 months of sleep you lost. He owes you for the stress of almost losing your business. He owes you for the arrogance of making you beg for what was already yours." She turned back to Julian, her voice returning to a sharp, rhythmic staccato. "In this state, the law allows for statutory interest on unpaid contracts. It allows for the recovery of all legal fees. And because you acted with what I perceive as bad faith and malicious intent to defraud a small business, I am looking at the maximum allowable penalties." Julian's mouth opened, then shut. He was a man who lived by algorithms, and the math was suddenly not in his favor. That's double the original amount," he stammered. "Consider it a disruption fee, Julian," the judge snapped. "You like that word, don't you? You disrupted Mr. Wright's life. You disrupted his employees' families. And you dared to walk in here and tell me that the process of justice is irrelevant? Well, let's see how irrelevant a $170,000 judgment feels when I attach it to your Series C assets and notify your board of directors that their CEO is a court-certified liar." The Vance empire wasn't crumbling yet, but the foundation was shaking. Julian looked at the gallery, at the cameras, and then at Thomas Wright. For the first time, he didn't see an old man or a legacy product. He saw the man who held the power to sink his reputation before the noon board meeting even began. Julian Vance was not a man who understood the concept of losing. In his world, a failure was simply a pivot, and a legal setback was just a cost of doing business. But as the judge's words began to cut through his billion-dollar armor, the cool tech genius mask finally melted away. It was replaced by something far more dangerous: the jagged, cornered desperation of a man who had never been told no by someone he couldn't fire or buy out. He stood up, not waiting for his lawyer's signal. He didn't just stand. He loomed over the defense table, his hands trembling not from fear, but from a toxic, white-hot rage. "You think you're teaching me a lesson?" Julian's voice had lost its smooth, boardroom texture. It was raspy now, vibrating with the arrogance of a man who believed his net worth made him a god. "Do you have any idea who I have on speed dial? I have more lobbyists in D.C. than you have bailiffs in this entire building. My legal team doesn't just argue contracts, they rewrite them. You make this judgment stick, and I will spend 10 times that amount making sure your career becomes as irrelevant as this tiny, pathetic room." The courtroom went cold. It was a direct public threat, a power move straight out of the Silicon Valley playbook. When the law stops you, you try to break the law, or the person enforcing it. Julian looked around the room, expecting the usual submissive silence he received from his employees. He expected to see the judge flinch. Instead, she leaned in. The judge's eyes, sharp as diamonds and twice as hard, seemed to pierce through Julian's expensive gray t-shirt and find the hollow space where his conscience should have been. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her gavel. She simply stared at him with a look of profound, icy pity. "Is that a threat, Julian?" she asked, her voice dangerously soft, carrying the weight of 30 years of absolute authority. "Because in my 3 decades on this bench, I've been threatened by cartel bosses, corrupt politicians, and men far more dangerous than a child who sells logistical algorithms from a beanbag chair. You see, your biggest mistake isn't your arrogance, it's your lack of imagination. You truly cannot imagine a world where you aren't the most important person in the room." She turned her gaze to the court stenographer. "Make sure every syllable of that statement is recorded. Let the record show that the defendant attempted to intimidate the court during a civil proceeding." Then, she turned back to Julian, whose face was beginning to drain of its color as the gravity of his words finally hit his brain. "You just turned a simple civil dispute into a potential criminal contempt charge. You want to talk about your legal muscle? Let's see how they handle a sheriff's escort. Because if you say one more word, one single syllable that sounds like a threat to the integrity of this court, you won't be heading to your noon board meeting in a limousine. You'll be heading to a 6x8 cell where the only brand equity you have is the number on your jumpsuit." The toxic defiance didn't just fade, it shattered. Julian Vance sank back into his chair. For the first time in his life, the man of the future was staring at a very bleak present. The silence that followed was suffocating. He wasn't a titan anymore. He was just a boy who had finally run out of playground to bully. The air in the courtroom had turned freezing. Julian Vance sat back down, but he didn't sit like a CEO anymore. He sat like a man who had just watched his entire operating system crash in real time. His lawyer, the man in the $3,000 suit, was no longer looking at his carbon fiber laptop. He was looking at the floor, his face a mask of professional defeat. In the world of law, there is a point where a client becomes indefensible not because the law is against them, but because their own character has become a toxic asset. Julian had crossed that line the moment he threatened the bench. "Mr. Vance," the judge began, her voice now possessing a terrifying, rhythmic finality. "You talk a lot about disruption. You think it's a business model. But in this room, disruption has a different name. It's called breach of contract. It's called unjust enrichment. And most importantly, it's called bad faith." She turned her attention to the final documents on her desk, her pen hovering over the judgment line like a guillotine blade. "You didn't withhold this money because the vision was wrong. You withheld it because you could. You withheld it because you thought Mr. Wright was too small, too old, and too irrelevant to fight back. You banked on his exhaustion. You banked on his poverty. I watched Thomas Wright. He wasn't cheering. He wasn't gloating. He simply closed his eyes, and for the first time in the entire trial, I saw his chest heave with a long, shaky breath. It was the breath of a man who realized he wouldn't have to go home and tell 12 families that they were out of work. It was the silence of dignity finally being heard over the noise of a billionaire's ego. "Here is the judgment of this court," the judge declared, the sound of her voice echoing like a final sentence. "I am awarding the plaintiff, Mr. Thomas Wright, the full contract amount of $85,000. Furthermore, under the bad faith provisions of this state's commercial code, I am doubling that amount as punitive damages for the intentional, emotional, and financial distress caused by the defendant. That is $170,000. Julian's lawyer jumped up. "Your Honor, that is an unprecedented multiplier for a civil." "Sit down," the judge snapped, not even looking at him. "I'm not finished. Mr. Vance mentioned his board of directors and his Series C funding. Since he brought his corporate status into my courtroom as a weapon of intimidation, I am going to treat it as such. I am directing a copy of this judgment, along with the transcript of Mr. Vance's threats against this court, to be sent directly to the lead investors of his firm. If you want to talk about brand equity, Julian, let's see how your investors feel about a CEO who is officially on record as a deceptive, bad faith actor who threatens judges when he loses a furniture dispute." The color left Julian's face entirely. He looked like a ghost in a gray t-shirt. The $170,000 was a sting, but the letter to his investors was a death blow. His future vision was suddenly clouded by the very real, very legacy consequences of his own arrogance. He had come in wanting to prove he was the most important person in the world. He was leaving as a cautionary tale. As the bailiff began to organize the paperwork for the judgment, the atmosphere in the room shifted one final time. The tension that had defined the last hour evaporated, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence. Julian Vance, the billionaire who had entered the room with the arrogance of an emperor, was now packing his laptop into his bag with shaky, uncertain hands. He didn't look at the judge, he didn't look at his lawyer, and he certainly didn't look at Thomas Wright. "Mr. Vance," the judge's voice echoed, not with malice, but with a cold, educational clarity. "Before you leave my courtroom, I want you to remember something. You came here today calling this place, and the man standing across from you, irrelevant. You believed that your digital footprint, your bank account, and your social status made you the protagonist of this story. But look around." She gestured to the room, the worn-out wood of the benches, the dust motes dancing in the light, and the hard-working people who had been waiting for their cases to be heard. True relevance isn't found in a Series C round or a viral post. True relevance is found in the work you leave behind and the integrity you carry when no one is watching. Mr. Wright built tables that will outlast your company. He built a reputation that survived your bullying. You, however, are leaving here today with a record that will follow you for a very long time. Thomas Wright stood up. He didn't offer a dramatic speech. He simply adjusted his cap and looked at the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. Then he looked at Julian. He didn't smile, and he didn't gloat. He simply nodded, a gesture of dignity that stung far worse than any insult could have. As Julian walked toward the exit, the doors seemed to loom over him. He was a man who had tried to build a kingdom on the sand of ego, only to find that the bedrock of the law was far more durable than he ever anticipated. He had wanted to teach the world a lesson in power. Instead, he had become the lesson. I watched him step out into the hallway, his head slightly bowed, his phone silent in his hand. He was no longer the titan of tech. He was just a man who had lost his way. And that is the truth about justice. It doesn't care about your net worth. It doesn't care about your followers, your board meetings, or your future vision. It only cares about the truth, the contract, and the person who kept their word. Julian Vance walked into this courtroom as a man who thought he was untouchable. He walked out as a man who finally understood that in the eyes of the law, everyone without exception is relevant.